From Sri Lanka to Bangladesh, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Nepal, Gen Z is rising up. The South Asia Spring has been gaining momentum as the youth take online onto the streets. And their demand for change seems to be contagious, with young people from Morocco to Madagascar protesting government corruption. So will Gen Z truly transform South Asia and beyond? And can economies adjust to their demands? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Asia's Gen Z. Well, Gen Z has known social media like no other generation. It was harnessed during the Arab Spring, and now it's rallied young people across Asia to rise up as well, protesting everything from economic mismanagement to social media blackouts and Nepo babies. Leaders across South Asia have been forced to respond and, in some cases, step down. So where's it all going? And will new leadership be able to address the foundations of discontent, cutting corruption while creating jobs and economic prosperity? Here's a look.
Across Asia, young people are no longer asking. They're demanding answers from those who they believe failed them. In Nepal, Indonesia, and the Philippines, a generation betrayed by corruption and inequality has turned protest into revolt. A pirate flag born from a Japanese manga has become Gen Z's banner of defiance across a region where old leaders have run out of answers.
It stands as a warning to the government to remember their duty to the people. Many Indonesians are raising the One Piece flag to make their voices heard, still holding out hope that those in power will fix what's broken.
In Indonesia, anger first erupted over lavish perks for politicians, from housing stipends to travel bonuses, while their salaries already towered 10 times above the average Indonesian worker. Then came the breaking point: a young delivery driver killed under an armoured police truck. His death turned protest into fury. In Nepal, a social media ban triggered chaos. Days later, the Prime Minister was gone, toppled by the same generation he dismissed as too young to understand power.
The main reason was corruption that arises with everyone who is ruling the country, who are leading the country. They undergo a lot of corruption. That results in less development, but still the youth were fighting for their employment. Youth still were struggling to live. But as lots of youth were struggling on their own condition, but every Nepo babies, the babies that politicians' babies were having a relaxed life. That creates hunger of revolution in youth.
In the Philippines, floods brought more than water. They exposed missing millions meant for recovery. As homes washed away, so did the public's patience. Different nations, same rage. A generation staring at privilege and seeing no place for themselves.
The important thing right now is to find a way to come together for Gen Z and this whole movement to come together and decide on a way forward that is acceptable to them, and not allow their movement to be hijacked by opportunists who are just waiting in the shadows for that moment.
Once hailed as Asia's tigers, these countries roared through the 1990s on the promise of unstoppable growth. But as that promise fades, it's their children filling the streets, demanding the future their parents were told would come, but never did.
So can Gen Z protesters bring about fundamental change in their countries? And can their economies even meet their demands? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from Canberra, Associate Professor at the Australian National University's College of Asia and the Pacific, Ross Tapsell. From Singapore, visiting Senior Fellow at ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute and former Chief Economist at the Asian Development Bank, Jayant Menon. And from Waterloo, Board Director at Amnesty International Canada, Saad Hammadi. Thanks all so much for being with me. Saad, I'll start with you and start by getting your impressions of what you're seeing across South Asia now. You're from Bangladesh, where a youth uprising really overthrew an entrenched power structure. So is this good Or as the cynics would say, do the youth need to be careful what they wish for?
In my interpretation, this is phenomenal. This is something that we have not seen for most part of our lives. The kind of waves of protest that we're seeing in Bangladesh, and before that it was in Sri Lanka, and then subsequently in so many other places in Indonesia, Philippines, Nepal, they all are testament to the kind of leadership that the youth wish to see or aspire to see. And this is indeed, I think, a requirement. They have that. This is like we have projected in this program that it's a revolution by the Gen Z, but it won't be as effective unless the masses join them. And the reason that the masses are joining them is because of the frustration, the entrenched frustration that has been born out of corruption, poor leadership, nepotism, and so many other forms of bad governance. So it's being led by the Gen Z, and they have fresh thoughts. I feel that the future can be uncertain, but what they have lived over the last 2 decades is not something that they wish to live in.
Right. I mean, you say it's a manifestation of what they wish to see or that they aspire to see, but the question is, will they see it? Because in too many cases, we've seen bad get worse. Do you think it will be different for these South Asian countries?
It's really uncertain. I mean, there's high probability that it can go either way. The way the protests unfolded in Bangladesh, it was born out of that frustration that they did not want to see the kind of corruption, the kind of lawlessness and poor human rights situations that was unfolding, and that kind of brought the people together. But after that revolution or uprising, so to speak, people have parted their own ways. There are different political ideologies and views, and that might not bring all the people under one roof as it did during the protests. So it can go in any direction. And I feel that that's why I was saying that there is an uncertainty in the future, and it might go on for some time. And it might not give the kind of result or aspirations that many youth have. But then again, there's no guarantee. If there is proper nurturing of this leadership, the unity that they have brought together through so many other forms, it might work well in their favor.
Okay, well, let's hope there is a strong silver lining to all of this. But Ross, I'll ask you, I mean, these protests, they are, quite broad in their reasons for discontent. It may have started with a single reason, but it's become, in almost all cases, a total rejection of the status quo, especially as concerns, the divide between the elite versus the rank and file.
Yeah, so economic pressures amongst young people is obviously a central driver of a lot of these protests, and anti-corruption has been a clear message, a driving message amongst youth in Southeast Asia and the countries that I work on, Indonesia, Malaysia and the Philippines. So we've seen big protests in the last month in Indonesia and also the Philippines after that. And that is coalesced around pressures around the economy, around the state budget being reduced, and around a belief that the existing elites of political elites are not actually working for them, that they're really only creating laws for themselves, and they're not creating laws and running the country in a way which is improving the economy, improving the cost of living, and improving the lives of ordinary people, and particularly younger people who, of course, are bearing the brunt at the most of pressures around unemployment. So youth unemployment is a big factor here. So I think the real question is, where does the economy head from here? And then that will lead us to answer that question of whether there will be more protests.
Yeah, well, let's ask then the economist about the economy, because, Jayant, economically, how can these grievances really be addressed? I mean, would a corruption-free government be able to truly create jobs at this point and provide for South Asia's young people? Is the money truly there? Are the job creation opportunities really there?
I think that's an excellent question, and this is one that we've been trying to answer for a long time. I think corruption manifests in many different ways. In many parts of the developing world, where institutions are weak, governance is poor, corruption sort of works pretty much like an additional tax. It's something you pay to grease the wheels, if you like, to help with facilitating economic activity in the absence of properly functioning institutions. But I think what we have seen lately is in the Philippines and Indonesia, for instance, is corruption getting out of control, where it's no longer just a tax. This is not a percentage being siphoned off the top, but most of the investment is siphoned off, and the projects never actually take place. We've seen that with the flood control projects in the Philippines, for instance, where as if the effects of climate change weren't bad enough, you've got a poor country with limited resources not getting the kinds of investments to try and mitigate these horrible effects of flooding and so on. So corruption is part of the story. It can be a big part if it's a massive, as we've seen in recent times, but it's a lot more than that. It's got to do with strengthening institutions, all kinds of institutions, and also improving the overall management of scarce public resources.
Yeah.
Both the
And that all comes down to
priorities.
good, honest government, knowing how to manage economy and caring about the greater good, investing in the greater good, particularly in the youth. But we have so many factors now. And Jayant, I'm going to stick with you because there's also the phenomenon of, with Trump's tariffs, a lot of cheap Chinese goods are now being dropped onto South Asian countries. And that's actually, from what everything I'm seeing is expected to get even worse. Because China wants to maintain its production levels, but needs to put them into certain markets. And if the U.S. isn't there anymore, it looks like South Asian countries in particular will receive a lot of Chinese manufacturing. And that would be, correct me if I'm wrong, the biggest base for job development. So what happens?
Okay, so on that particular point, I guess what we must recognize is the way in which production is organized these days, as opposed to 30, 40 years ago, is that global supply chains operate when it comes to manufacturers, certainly, and also in some other sectors. And when it's produced through these supply chains, everyone has a part to play. So a lot of these so-called cheap Chinese imports have value addition from the countries that are concerned about being flooded with those goods. So it's not the old-fashioned, produce everything from start to end and sell it in another country. Okay. So this is an inclusive model of production. But having said that, there are still challenges. We are in a world where protection is rising, and there will be a lot of disruption.
Yeah, sure. It's hard. It's really hard to know how the value chains will be worked out and hopefully be fair for all the players involved. But otherwise, there are the other issues of who's going to manage the economy. And Saad, I'll ask you this, because these are, as we said, Gen Z, mostly youth-based uprisings. So what about the actual youth leaders? It's ironic that in Nepal and in Bangladesh, as you've seen, the leaders that ended up taking over are actually the age of the protesters' grandparents. So is there a young youth movement that's perhaps more in touch with Gen Z that would provide less corruption and stronger leadership that the youth is looking for?
Every country is different. And if you talk about Bangladesh, the current composition of the cabinet does have youth representation as well. It's just that not necessarily just having the youth will really bring in the change. The composition of cabinet requires the experience and expertise of both foreseeing the kind of changes that are required. So while the youth might have the aspiration of some of the things that they wish to see, experience does matter. And I think when this cabinet was formed in Bangladesh, it was composed of both the youth and the seniors who have had role in the past in shaping the economy, in enforcing human rights and other political frontiers. Having said that, I don't personally think that the current administration in Bangladesh is able to live up to the expectations that they had in the beginning. The chief advisor, Dr. Yunus himself, has said on many occasions that things have not gone the way that he had expected. It's a huge bureaucracy and the system that has been there for decades, and there are political elements from before that needs to be cut across to bring in the changes, and there are resistances within the system. So it has taken a huge toll for Bangladesh, and I'm sure it's the same for other countries as well. On the contrary, Sri Lanka has fared well since the kind of uprising that they've had in 2022. The economy has done well. There have been a huge change in the political leadership as well. But no country is outside of the criticisms of human rights violations and the kind of developments that's there in the aspiration.
Right.
So yeah, it's
yeah, and
really. I mean, you have all different sides.
It is a mixed bag, but you have highlighted one common conundrum here, and that, okay, once a power structure is kind of overthrown or somewhat dismantled, you find that the people with the experience end up being either those, part of the maybe political dynasties or the same political history that the people were seeking to get rid of. So you think Sri Lanka is, correct me if I misheard you, is perhaps the one example where they've been able to restart with a cleaner slate?
So has been the report of the transition that they've had, and the current leadership that Sri Lanka has was not foreseen for the longest time until that uprising took place in 2022, and eventually the election that has taken place. So Sri Lanka's leadership appears to be better. There have not been any reports as such of going things haywire at this time. On the contrary, in case of Bangladesh, we are hearing about the kind of political transition that might happen. It's still not very clear, and it's not very optimistic as yet. There are a lot of ifs and buts. There are a lot of caveats to what might come across. There's a lot of conservative elements that are being foreseen. The women in the country that I have spoken to feel and fear that the transitions are not very hopeful.
Okay.
And it probably means that there needs to be a lot more work in the process to have a transition that the youth really aspired to see.
Okay, Ross, let me ask you this. I mean, have we seen this style of phenomenon before historically, and that there are some lessons that these movements could learn from? I mean, even going back, I don't know, to the French Revolution, for example, that overthrew a royal dictatorship. Okay, we know in Nepal that the royal family had already their power had somewhat dissipated. But again, are there cycles here that we're seeing that we can take some lessons from?
Well, certainly in Southeast Asia, there's been a long and illustrious history of reform movements and protest movements leading to more democratic change. Philippines in 1986 with the People Power movement, ousting the Ferdinand Marcos Sr. His son, of course, is now the president of the Philippines. And Indonesia, 1997-98, where you saw a reform movement oust long-term 33-year rule dictator Suharto. So those movements and those enormous inspiring movements were student-driven. They were driven by youth movements and by new technologies, the internet in the late 1990s, for example. So you can look at those periods of history and of very contemporary history and say, well, there's cases there which can inspire, and I think young Southeast Asians are doing that right now. And I think what is possibly missing at the moment from now compared to those periods is there a vibrant and coalesced opposition that can really drive an agenda that will produce a really structured and clear opposition change. And that is currently not the case, because what you've got is a very strong government with a overarching, largely every political party is part of the government now in Indonesia in particular. So is there an opposition that can take advantage of these protests and say, well, we are offering an alternative? And I think a lot of the frustration that's coming out at the moment from young people is they don't see any alternative.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So that's really up to a new movement to bring.
Ross, you mentioned the Philippines, and that's arguably ironic because, part of this movement in some of these countries has been about these so-called Nepo babies. And in the Philippines, you could arguably say Ferdinand Marcos is the ultimate Nepo baby. His father ran a basic empire in the Philippines that was eventually overthrown. But now he seems to be identifying with the protesters. Are they buying it?
Well, I guess the first point is dynasty politics is entrenched in Philippines politics. I mean, name recognition is such a big part of an electoral victory and of course the way in which certain families dominate certain areas of the Philippines means that there's an entrenchment there of dynasty politics. So it is important to say that Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is not unique, and currently the most vibrant opposition to his presidency is the daughter of Rodrigo Duterte, Sarah Duterte, who's the vice president. And so across the spectrum, there is a lot of entrenchment that really you continue to vote for the family name, and in this current situation, you've got Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who is trying desperately to counter the opposition of the Dutertes. They were once aligned. They were aligned for the 2022 election, and now they've split because Rodrigo Duterte is in The Hague, and there's a massive split and polarization now in Philippines politics. So he is, of course, trying to associate himself with the protesters and trying to, maneuver his bloc towards them. But of course, for many people, that's not enough. They still see him part of the entrenched elite.
Yeah. Jayant, final question for you then, because we've been hearing as of late in the last years that, the so-called Asian tigers of the 90s have really, they've lost their claws. They're not the booming economies that once many thought were going to redistribute, the economic powers around the world. So tell us one of the countries, China aside, where you feel there's genuine hope if their economies are restructured in light of these protests, that the money will be there, and if properly applied, a good model for governance, especially economic governments, could be formed.
Okay, so I think firstly, I wouldn't say that these countries have necessarily run out of steam. They've become a lot richer, and like we see with the European countries, once you get to that level, it's harder to grow at these ridiculously high rates of growth that we've seen in the past. China was growing at an incredible rate, and now they're slowing down, and most countries do. I don't know if there are models really to look at. Singapore presents itself as one case where, good governance and transparency has helped lift living standards and incomes strongly, although it's a city-state, very different from some of the large, populous, poor developing countries all around it. But I think the one thing I would like to emphasize is their commitment to openness and outward-looking policies. I know that part of these protests have brought in globalization and agreed that the benefits of globalization haven't been equally shared, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think, buying into the protectionist sort of sentiments that have come with the anti-globalization push will not serve these countries well going forward. They need to remain open and outward-looking. They've brought down poverty very sharply as a result, and that should be the future course as well.
Saad, quick 30 seconds for your final thoughts.
Oh, okay. So in that sense, I feel that this uprisings were necessary in these countries where there've been pent-up frustrations, and I feel that this is a way forward to show that human rights should be at the center and heart of the policies that governments define, and not to repeat the kind of violations that have been committed, whether with regards to corruption or with regards to the kind of brutalities and the kind of violations that they have committed. And that's what the youth have aspired to move out of and walk away from.
Okay, Saad, that will be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us, and our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.